So today's podcast of Practical Veterinary Medicine is Linda Niedweske. My sister is joining us, and she is a lawyer, and I will let her explain what she does and what we will be discussing.
So thank you for inviting me onto your podcast. I think it's very exciting what you're doing. I'm an employment attorney by specialization, but my pro bono work has to do with animal law. I'm on the Board of Trustees of the New Jersey Lawyers in Defense of Animals and also on the Animal Protection League of New Jersey. So I have extensive experience working in the area of animal law. And so when Ira asked me what I might want to discuss, I thought that the best thing we could discuss is the kind of legal precautions you can take to make sure that your animals are cared for if you die or become disabled. And the reason I thought this was particularly important was because oftentimes I, as an attorney, or I, as a board member of either the Lawyers in Defense of Animals or Animal Protection League, will get calls that somebody's either become disabled or passed away or for some reason can't keep their animals anymore. And the animals are the ones that end up either being put into a shelter or being euthanized. Sometimes they're just thrown on the street. And I think Ira can attest to the fact that this will happen. And he probably has also gotten many of these calls saying, can you please take my animal? And oftentimes these are animals who are very loved in their home. And the people who either become disabled or die would be mortified if they knew that a family member didn't step up or a friend didn't step up and the animals who they adored were no longer cared for. So at one time we were able to create pet trusts and name the pet or pets as the beneficiaries of the trust, where we named trustees and we gave the details of how these animals should be cared for. But the trusts are no longer enforceable. And so the question is, how do you care for an animal and make sure that they're cared for after you're no longer able to do so? If you only have it referenced in a will, then there is a gap between the time that you become disabled or die and the time that the will is enforced or probated, which could take several months. So you always need a contingency plan. And at this point, what I recommend to people is that they create some sort of an enforceable contract. And so the contract would identify who is the person or persons or organization or whomever it is that will take care of the animals during either that interim period until the will is probated, or will continue to care for them even after the will is probated. And so there would be a contract that would be enforceable with the organization or the people or whomever it is. And there should be money set aside into a bank account that is readily accessible by those individuals or those organizations, that when they can then kick in and they can take advantage of until the will is probated. So those are the things that I think really need to be thought out carefully. Oftentimes people will say, do you think that we should consider a sanctuary? And the problem that I have with sanctuaries is that some are not reputable and some are taking in way too many animals. And then we hear these horror stories of a sanctuary where people have paid good money for their animals to be cared for. And the next thing we know, that there's hundreds of animals at this location that are in horrible condition and are just not being cared for, so that the people who start the sanctuary maybe had really good intentions, but ultimately took in too many. And now the animal is in a worse situation than if they had been euthanized. So those are the kinds of things that you really need to think about, is what do you want to do with your animals after you're no longer cared for them? Is there somebody who you can really trust that will really take advantage of the need for these animals to be continue in the lifestyle to which they become accustomed, as the saying goes? So that's, I think, really important for those that really do care about their animals. What are you going to do? You need to speak with the people. You need to ask them, what are they prepared to do? What can they do? Provide them with all information with regard to the veterinarians that they've been seeing, if there's any sort of special medical needs that the animal needs, but have a whole portfolio of information set aside, which somebody can walk in and just immediately take a look at and know what the animal needs. And I'm sure, Ira, you as the veterinarian have had situations where people are no longer able to care for their animals, and then you have no medical records or history to be able to indicate.
It happens all the time. The other thing is, what happens if the person goes into a nursing home or dies, whatever, and the animal winds up in the shelter because the police come to the house, rescue squad comes to the house, there's nobody there, and they take the animal to the shelter. What options do they have?
So the issue is that if you don't have any contingency, then the animal will be put into a shelter. And what most people don't understand is that shelters are not no kill. Shelters will kill, euthanize, but kill really is the term. They will kill an older animal, an animal that's not well, an animal that's not particularly friendly. They may keep, if they can, they may keep an animal who is friendly and adoptable and relatively young, but otherwise those other animals will be euthanized because they just don't have the room and they're not really adoptable. So that the only recourse that someone would have is if there is a contract where someone specifically states that somebody has the authority to come in and act on their behalf to take care of the animal, then they can do that. And I can tell you a story of where things fell apart, where there was a woman who I knew who had 9 cats. She never created any sort of official documentation to say what she wanted to do with her cats or who would take care of them. And as a result, the individual who she had a verbal agreement with reneged on it. The woman's nephew came in, who was not a cat lover, and said, this house is in deplorable condition, called animal control, and they wholesale just rounded up these cats and took them to a shelter, which this woman never would have permitted. And she had money where she would have been able to pay someone to take the cats. But because it happened so quickly, the rescue groups that I work with were unable to come in and assess the cats. We didn't know anything about them. And unfortunately, most of the animals were euthanized. Had she had a written document that I, as the attorney, would have had control of, I would have been able to go into court to stop them taking the animals and to ensure that they were cared for properly. And the woman who agreed that she would take responsibility would then have been required to step up and do so. And that gets me to another point, is that you can name somebody who would be the caregiver of the animals, but you also want to have an alternate just in case the person either isn't able to or has passed away or they themselves have become disabled. And if you do create this, you might want to put the money into a trust so that a third party is also overseeing the care of the animals and doling out money little by little as is needed. So you would have a trust before the person dies, and you would have or become disabled, and you would have a trust also that would be put into a will that would also create a trust if there's something about the need for both trusts, if you want something before the will is probated and after. So you have the recourse, but you have to make, plans in advance.
So basically, if you don't have any plans, you're taken into a facility, or if you die and you don't have anything in place, the animals are pretty much on their own. And is there any way for, like, a person just couldn't come in and say, I was friends with this person, let me take the animals. The shelter is under no obligation to give them to this person.
So that was the situation that I had with the woman who didn't create the documents. I called the nephew and I said, please hold off doing anything. I have a group, we will come in, we'll assess the animals, we'll bring in a vet, we'll do whatever needs to be done. Just give us a couple of weeks. And he said, absolutely not. I had no documentation to show that I had any authority to be able to do this. He had the animals rounded up the next day and they were taken right into the shelter. So you're absolutely right. There's no recourse. There's no legal right to be able to do that. The shelter was more than happy to have us come and take the animals, but at that point we had no ability to go in and really assess them. There was didn't have the time to be able to do it. It just became very chaotic. And the shelter doesn't have any obligation to release the animals.
And this applies across the board, small animals, exotics, equine, goats, whatever.
It's across the board, and it's even more important if you have something like a macaw or any of the large parrots who could live 80 or 90 years. Those can go on forever. And the problem with them, and I think, Ira, you could attest this better than me, is that they become very attached to people. And if all of a sudden there isn't some sort of mechanism made for caring for them, they get shipped around from family to family or person to person. And then the next thing you know, you've got all sorts of aberrant behavior where maybe they're pulling feathers or they're biting or they're squawking all the time. They could then be subject to abuse, or ultimately they'll end up, being euthanized or put into a shelter.
Very often they go to rescues that can resell them and without any kind of background checks on these people.
That's right. And then the bird is in a worse situation again than if they had been euthanized, because they're put into some sort of a shelter or sanctuary where they're really not being cared for. So the moral of the story is to make sure that you really take precautionary and proactive measures to make sure that your animals are well cared for. And it should be in writing, because oftentimes people make verbal representations, and then when the time comes, they're like, no, I can't do it, I don't want to do it, or whatever reason, and then they totally renege, and the animals are the ones that suffer.
Can you have your lawyer be the person in charge?
Sure, you could have your lawyer, you could have your veterinarian, you could have a rescue group. We created documents for a couple, older couple who had 5 cats, and they were naming the rescue group to be able to come in to take the cats if anything were to happen to them. So there's a variety of people. You can have friends, you can have family, you can have a vet, you can have all sorts of people, sometimes rescue groups that you've worked with or that maybe you got the animals from would, want to take the animals back if that's where you adopted them from and you now have a contract. But there's a myriad of options as to who you can speak with and who can take control of your animals and give them the best quality of life.
And well, the other question is, you do have this paperwork, but a shelter comes in and they take the animals, you're injured, you die, whatever. And how are they supposed to know there's paperwork for all this? Where would that be available? How would you say, okay, I'm could be responsible for my friend's dog in California. I'm in New Jersey. I don't know. They died, and 2 days later I find out that all the animals were taken. What do you do to make sure that the paperwork is available?
So typically what I recommend is that you have something in a very visible place when people come into the house. So in your scenario where somebody passes away, there should be something like on a, under a magnet on a kitchen, on a refrigerator or something very visible, that if you have an attorney who you've used for trust and estates or who would be notified or whoever the next of kin is, they should have a copy of the contract. But you should have something in a very visible location. And particularly those people who don't have next of kin or don't have friends or don't have any family, you want to maybe put something, a magnet on the refrigerator or some very visible location that says, in the event of any emergency for my animals, here's who you should contact. And that's easy, that you can either create it yourself, or the Humane Society used to have these little forms that you could put on your front door that would notify people, and it wouldn't necessarily say who that they should contact, but it would at least notify that there are animals inside that needed to be taken care of. But I would say you need to put it in a very visible location, should there ever be an issue like what you're describing.
Okay. Any other advice for this?
So with regard to this, I think we've covered everything. I think what people should know is that one of the other things that I do is I also work with people who have disabilities, and what are their rights to maintain service animals or emotional support animals. And I think it's important, if you do have a disability, to know that you do have certain rights, and that if from a landlord or if you're living in a rental location, be mindful of the rights that you have as a person with a disability. And you can always contact an attorney who will tell you what those rights are to maintain those animals, even in a facility where it says no pets, because these aren't considered pets. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is that in the state of New Jersey, there is a statute that if you're living in a senior housing complex, you have the right to have at least one animal, not even a service or an emotional support, but you're allowed to have at least one animal. And typically they make it a small animal, like a 25-pound dog or a small cat or something. But just to let you know that there are laws out there that protect people should they want to have a pet. And so it's important to know your rights.
How about just a regular you're going into an apartment? Can they keep you from having animals in an apartment complex?
They can keep you from having animals in an apartment complex if that's what the rules are. And you need to be very careful that you look at it. And where we find a lot of the difficulties are in these facilities like condo associations or townhouse associations that have really strict rules. And even if you see somebody with an animal and you say, well, everyone else has an animal, why can't I? Our experience has been that sometimes they decide one day out of the blue that they're going to crack down and make everyone get rid of their animals because it's gotten over the top. So be mindful that if you're moving into one of these complexes, that if the agreement or the lease or whatever it is, or the purchase agreement specifically says no pets, don't be under some illusion that you're going to be, protected, because they may come to you one day and say, get rid of your animal. We're now enforcing our provisions. But that's where sometimes emotional support or service animals come into play, where you can override those prohibitions.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. If anybody has any questions, you can email me and I'll pass it on to Linda at Dr. Ira .dvm@gmail.com, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that we can. If you have any questions for your particular state, I guess they would just go see their own attorney and find out what's going on in that particular state for this, right?
Yes, and each state has their own set of rules and regulations, so you're right, you need to check out what the regs are with regard to your animals
Okay.
in that particular state.
All right, great, thanks.
Thank you for having me. I think this is a
Thank you for
wonderful
coming
service you're
on,
doing.
and we will cut it here. And if anybody has any questions, that's the email to send it to. And Linda, thank you very much.
Thank you.